I made this fabric mask following the instructions from another YouTube video on how to make these. And overall, I just love the design. I love that there's a nose wire over here to conform to the shape of your nose. And I also love that there's a pocket on the back for you to insert a filter and make it more effective. I find that the dimensions of this mask are just perfect. So when I went to the grocery store yesterday and I was looking at other people's masks, some of the people wearing masks had a gap over here on the side where air can enter, and it's just not an effective design. But when I have other people try on this mask in particular, the size on the side right here is just right, to the point where there's a great amount of seal and very little air can get in. When I wear this mask, basically, I feel like I'm suffocating and not getting enough air. Okay, anyway, I plan on making hundreds of these masks to give away, and I found that it was just taking me way too long to make this, even though I love this design and I just find it's very effective. What I'm going to show you guys today is I'm going to show you different strategies and techniques that you can follow to shave a few minutes off of creating this mask. Because when you're making a few hundred of these masks to give away, like I am, then a few minutes here and there for every single mask really adds up. If you've made these, you've made a few of these, you just know how exhausting and tiring it can be. But anyway, please keep watching until the end of this video for the modifications that I've made to the construction of this mask while keeping the same exact design. So to begin with, you're going to want to prep all of your supplies, and that includes cutting the fabric to the correct size. And I'm saving time by having someone else cut the fabric for me. He can use his industrial machine to cut 60 masks in 3 minutes. So it definitely saves me a lot of time and labor cutting. But if you don't have someone to help you with that, then of course you're going to have to use a rotary cutter and a cutting board and a ruler. Just please don't manually cut these with your scissors. It saves so much time if you used a rotary cutter, and a sharp one at that. I'm using a very old rotary cutter that I had from 5 years ago. Joann is sold out. I can't get them, so sucks, but I have to keep cutting again and again. I'm trying to iron as little as possible because I want to stick to sewing only. So I'm outsourcing this to a volunteer to help me iron the bias tape. And this volunteer is making the bias tape using a pin. Of course, cut everything to size before you begin. Now this video is telling you to serge or zigzag the short edges on both sides. I don't recommend doing that. You can save yourself time by only zigzagging one side. The reason for that is because the other side is going to get folded down and no one's going to see it. It's not going to be exposed, so it doesn't matter. You don't need to use clips. Don't waste your time using pins. You don't need to use a ruler either. When you're making a few hundred of these, you're wasting time by picking up your ruler and putting your ruler back down. So what I did instead is I marked 1.5 inches on my index finger, and I used my index finger as a reference guide instead. And you don't need to backstitch 4 times. Instead, I only backstitched 2 times. Both times are where the opening is. I'm not going to backstitch by where the edges of the fabric are. I'm outsourcing the ironing to somebody else. It's just taking too much time. Top stitching is fine, just don't backstitch. Straight stitch all the way. Again, you don't need to use a ruler. You can use your index finger as a reference guide for this part. So I use both my index fingers. This person is telling you to stitch all the way around, and that's just not necessary. It's okay if you're making one mask, but not when you're making hundreds of them. Instead, what I did is I top stitched the bottom edge that's folded, and then I top stitched the top. I skipped adding the twist tie at this point because I wanted to make mine removable, so instead I'm using cross grain ribbon. At this point, this person is saying to make pleats of any size you like, but the first 24 masks that I made, I spent more time trying to make these pleats than the actual time I spent on sewing. So what I did is I used a pleating jig to keep the size of the pleats consistent with every single mask that I make, and instead of like trying to eyeball it every single time. And I didn't even need to iron. You do not need to clip. If you have a pleating jig, you don't need to individually clip all your masks. You don't need to iron your pleats. You don't even need to stitch your pleats down. It just adds unnecessary bulk to the sides of your mask. Now this part you do need to do, which is applying the bias to both sides. I agree with that. But you notice how this person is cutting it to the right size at this point. My bias was already cut to the correct size before I even started sewing. That's because I already predicted that the final size of my mask right here is going to be 3.5 inches, and I added 1/2 inch to both sides, so that makes it 4.5. You don't need to use all these clips to sew on your bias tape. This person makes the casing and then inserts the elastic after using a safety pin. And I found it way too troublesome. It took me like maybe 5 minutes for each mask to insert the elastic after the fact. And that's because it kept getting caught in the fold instead of trying to get through the opening on the other side. So I insert my elastic before I sew on the final stitch for the bias tape. I just try not to get any elastic caught with any of the stitching because the elastic should be able to move freely around. So this is the end, and it's at this point that I'm going to have someone else iron the pleats down just to make sure that they keep their shape after they get washed. And I am also at this point inserting the nose wire in. Okay, that's it guys. Hope you like, subscribe, and comment below, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.